The paper trembled between her fingers the moment the total came into focus, and for a second, the noise of the cafe dissolved into a hollow ringing that made her chest feel too small for her breath. Margaret had walked in believing this would be just another quiet lunch break, another small reward after a long morning of work. But the numbers on the bill told a different story, one that felt personal in a way prices never should. If this happened to you, if you suddenly realized a place you trusted was silently pushing you away, would you stay quiet and swallow the hurt, or would you stand up and risk being seen as difficult, unwanted, or worse, invisible? She stood near the polished counter of a modern cafe in downtown Portland, Oregon, her blue dress slightly creased from hours at her desk job, her hair pulled back with the same care she used to keep her life together. The cafe was bright and expensive looking, full of soft music and people who seemed to belong there without effort. Margaret had been coming here once a week ever since her divorce finalized, a ritual she used to remind herself that she was still allowed small comforts. She worked in accounting for a mid-sized logistics company, paid her rent on time, attended church on Sundays, and tried her best to rebuild a sense of normalcy after a marriage that had quietly collapsed. Nothing about her life felt extravagant, but nothing felt shameful either, at least not until she looked at the bill and noticed the added charge that wasn't listed on the menu. At first she assumed it was a mistake, the kind that happened when systems updated or when staff were distracted, but then she noticed it again, a subtle surcharge that hadn't been there in previous weeks. She glanced around, watching the other customers laugh and sip their drinks, noticing how their receipts were folded away without concern. A heavy thought settled in her chest as she wondered if this extra charge appeared on every bill or just hers. What if? The welcome she thought she felt was never real. What if the smiles and politeness were just a thin layer covering quiet judgment? The idea stung more than the money ever could, because it touched an old fear she carried from childhood, the fear of being tolerated but never truly accepted. Margaret grew up in a small town in Iowa, raised in a modest Christian household where kindness was taught as a duty and humility as a virtue. Her parents had little money but abundant warmth, and she learned early how to stretch a dollar and make do without complaint. When she married Thomas straight out of college, she believed stability and love would grow naturally. But years later, she found herself signing divorce papers in a silent office, realizing that some things slowly break without a clear moment of collapse. Since then, she had worked hard to rebuild her confidence, reminding herself daily that her worth wasn't measured by who stayed or who left. Standing in that cafe, though, holding a bill that suggested otherwise, all those carefully rebuilt walls felt thin and fragile. She paid without saying anything, because that was easier, because she didn't want to be the woman who caused a scene or demanded explanations. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, the city felt sharper, louder, more indifferent. The extra charge lingered in her mind like an accusation, and she wondered how many times she had accepted quiet discomfort just to avoid being a burden. If you were in her place, would you tell yourself it didn't matter, or would you finally admit that small wounds, left unattended, could shape the way you saw yourself? That evening, Margaret sat alone in her apartment, the bill unfolded on the kitchen table as if it were evidence in a case she wasn't sure she wanted to prosecute. She prayed softly, not for justice or a payment, but for clarity, asking God why such a small thing could hurt so deeply. What came to her instead was a memory of her mother saying that dignity wasn't loud, but it wasn't silent either. It lived somewhere in between, in the courage to acknowledge pain without letting it harden you. The next morning, something in Margaret shifted, subtle but firm, like a decision finally ripening. She returned to the cafe the following week, her heart pounding harder than it should have for something so simple. She ordered the same meal, sat at the same counter, and when the bill arrived, she checked it immediately. The surcharge was there again, unchanged, unapologetic. This time, instead of folding it away, she waited. Her hands were steady, even though her chest felt tight, and when the manager eventually approached, she showed him the bill, not with anger, but with quiet resolve. She explained that she had noticed an extra charge on her recent visits and wanted to understand why. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just a woman asking to be seen. What followed surprised her. The manager looked genuinely confused, reviewed the system, and discovered that a neighborhood-based pricing adjustment had been incorrectly applied to certain customers due to a clerical error. Margaret listened as he apologized, explaining that it was never meant to target individuals, only delivery zones, and that it should never have appeared on in-store bills. He refunded the extra charges, not just from that day, but from previous visits, and thanked her for bringing it to their attention. The moment didn't feel triumphant, but it felt healing in a quiet, unexpected way. She realized then that she had mistaken exclusion for intention and silence for rejection, and yet her pain had still been real, still valid. As Margaret walked home, the city felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. She thought about how many people carried invisible hurts into ordinary places, how many moments of misunderstanding grew heavier, simply because no one spoke up. Her struggle hadn't been about money or coffee, but about worth, about whether she believed she deserved fairness without apology. That night, she wrote a note in her journal, reminding herself that belonging sometimes required participation, that grace could coexist with self-respect. Life didn't suddenly become easier after that day. Margaret still worked long hours, still attended church alone, still faced evenings where loneliness pressed against her like a weight. But something inside her had softened and strengthened at the same time. She began volunteering at a local shelter, offering accounting help to families trying to rebuild after loss. She smiled more freely, not because the world had become kinder, but because she had reclaimed a piece of herself she hadn't realized she was giving away. Just before the story ends, pause for a moment and ask yourself in the comments what you would have done if you were standing there with that bill in your hands, feeling unseen. Margaret never went back to that cafe out of habit again, but when she did return, it was with her head held higher, knowing she was welcome not because someone decided it, but because she believed it herself. And if this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you of your own quiet struggles or second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, only if it truly touched you.